Many episodes of this show will be dedicated to the stories of how and why native Georgians fell in love with the sport of hockey. And my story seemed like a logical place to start. Let's talk about that and more on this episode of Peach State Puck. Hello once again, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are listening to. And thanks for being a returner here. Thanks for being a repeat customer on the Peach State Puck podcast. As of recording, we just released it yesterday, the first episode. And of course, you know, as any creator does, you're hyper aware of the viewership numbers, but what spoke to me more and what warmed the cockles of my heart more was the amount of people who reached out and just said, hey, we've been, you know, either waiting for something like this, or we can't wait to tell our story, or, you know, we're just glad somebody's talking about the culture of hockey in Georgia. And I really hope that we can continue to bring just a great product to you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed episode 1, and I hope that we can, you know, keep bringing you some Peach State Puck pleasure here on the show. This episode will be dedicated to my story, and I think ultimately many episodes of this show will have people. It'll be probably largely interview driven, but we'll probably have many people come on it and talk about their experience with hockey, how they grew into it, how they fell in love with it, and what it means to them now. And since a lot of content will be directed toward that, I figured why not start with my story. And my story probably happened later in life than a lot of y'all. Well, maybe not, because I think talking with a lot of the people that I've talked to at Athens games, you know, some of them could be, you know, in their 40s, 50s, 60s and still discovering the sport. My first memory of anything hockey related was the game on PlayStation 2 NHL 06. And I always played with the Thrashers just because, you know, it made sense. You're from Atlanta, play as the Atlanta team. For whatever reason, the player that stuck out to me the most was Bobby Holik. And, you know, that kind of leads me right into the first steps that I ever took at Blueland, Phillips Arena at the time, home of the Atlanta Thrashers. And, you know, I don't really recall what my feelings about it were at the time. I think you definitely could feel the electricity stepping into the building. And I think so much of that was because of the sport itself. You know, Phillips Arena, you know, was maybe hit or miss if you were getting, you know, a hyped out or full crowd at Atlanta Thrashers games. But I think I have a lot to thank for. My father had a friend, a client, somebody that he worked with that loved hockey, grew up with hockey. And because of that, you know, was always buying tickets to Thrashers games and, you know, inviting my father, inviting our family. And those were really the first experiences I had with live hockey in person. Ultimately, that would change a ton as I would grow up. I was probably around, I must have been 12 or 13. And my father comes to me one day. My father grew up, was born in Iran and didn't move to this country until 1977, being born in 1955. So came to the United States at 22 years old. And he was telling me about a nephew that he had, who was at the time was a little rough around the edges back in their homeland. And I thought, I was okay, why are you telling me this story? He said, well, this guy is reaching out and wanting to connect and kind of, you know, establish a family connection. You know, he has a son, and, you know, he thinks it would be great if you two were, you know, to meet and have a bond. And so, native Iranian, my cousin Murdad, who then moved to Sweden, met a Finnish woman, and had a child. And the three of them came over to the United States for the very first time. And I remember being obsessed with baseball at the time. Baseball was my first big sport, my first sport that I truly, truly loved. And I had a catcher's mitt and was just throwing the ball up in the air and catching it. And that's when this family that I had never knew or met came into my life for the first time. And of course, there was a boy that was closer to my age. I was 12. He was maybe 14 or 15 at the time. And kid dressed very European. He was probably wearing like white pants or something like that. I was like, after Labor Day, really? No, just looked like a really, for his age, built athletic kid. And I was like, okay, cool. At least we're gonna be able to toss the ball around or something like that. And he came bearing gifts. He came sporting, giving me a bag filled with hockey jerseys in it that had big teams in Sweden, teams like AIK and Djurgården, teams that he had played for. And over the years, I would grow to be very, very close with this cousin of mine. And, it felt like we were as thick as thieves, closer than even, some family members can be. And that led to a lot of summer vacations, visiting him in Sweden, having this big family reunion in Turkey. It's even more severe now, as you guys know, with the war going on in Iran. But there's very, very little places to be able to travel to and get a travel visa as an Iranian. And so we had a family reunion in Istanbul, Turkey, when I was about 14 or 15. And I was going through an extremely dark time, I think, as a lot of 14 or 15-year-olds maybe do. And it ultimately changed the trajectory of my life for the better. And he was a big part of that as well. We had yearly vacations during the summer where I would see him, and it felt like every year our bond would grow stronger. Until one night, we're up in my room and playing FIFA, as we had probably 1,000 times before that. And he said, "Hey, hockey's getting pretty serious. I think I might be getting drafted in the NHL next year." And I said, "Wow, I mean, that's insane. That's crazy." I said, "Where do you think you're going to go in the draft?" He goes, "Well, they think I could be 100th overall." And ultimately, in the 2000 NHL entry draft, he would end up going 6th overall. And that is because my cousin is Mika Zibanejad, a current player for the New York Rangers, but drafted in 2011 by the Ottawa Senators. And, I always feel a little dumb. I try to be a little bit more careful about throwing his name around with the correct amount of weight, because obviously I'm extremely proud of him and he's someone who means a lot to me. But at the same token, it's like you don't want to use his name for the wrong reasons. Ultimately, though, he's an integral part of this story because of what he means to my journey toward where I'm at now, to having this show and talking about hockey and being able to have some of my bottom dollar be attributed to hockey. So summer of 2011, we're in Minnesota for the draft. And I remember watching, the five guys go ahead of him. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins for the Oilers was number one that year. And them calling his name, and we'll have the video here of them calling his name and us coming down. And it was just such a huge part of my life at that point. I mean, it was one of the coolest things that had happened to me. And those experiences just kept getting cooler and cooler. he would end up going to the World Juniors, and Sweden would win its first World Junior Hockey Championship since the 80s, and this was back in 2012. And the gold medal game was, I believe, scoreless going into overtime. And, who else after this, long period of overtime, I think it was towards the end of the first period of overtime, Mika comes crashing up the wing, collects the board off the wall, goes forehand, backhand, sticks it behind the Russian goaltender.
Down in front of the Swedish bench, Zibanejad in a row. Mika Zibanejad scores! Mika Zibanejad, golden goal! Sweden wins the World Junior Hockey Championship.
And to hear him, calling me later that night, with all of the excitement in his voice. And I think a lot of it was probably attributed to him being an 18, 19-year-old kid, thinking that he was going to go back to Sweden and be, somewhat of a hero. And I think ultimately that was more or less what happened. And then the opportunities for myself would kind of get cooler as the years would go on. Having a Swedish cousin who was an Ottawa Senator, meeting Daniel Alfredsson and Erik Karlsson were very, very cool experiences, actually. I didn't think about this until just reading this part of the story on my notes. I remember meeting Erik Karlsson, I think it might have been my 20th birthday. And we were in Washington, D.C., December time. And, we're down in the, where away families meet up with their family members post hockey games. And Erik Karlsson walks by and Mika flags him down and he walks over, and I said, I just thought of myself maybe as a comedian, and not a very funny one, but I shook his hand and I just said, I really admire your musculature. And I don't know if I meant that as a joke, if I meant that genuinely. And of course, one of the best blue liners in the league at that time just went, all right, and walked away, as he probably rightfully should have done. Later on, as a Ranger, Mika would come to the family room at Madison Square Garden. Again, very, very cool experiences to have. Not only to be able to see your cousin in, I think, one of the biggest arenas in the world, but also at certain points being able to be in the same room as someone like Henrik Lundqvist or Artemi Panarin. One of my favorite memories that had to do with his playing career was going for New Year's Eve for the Winter Classic up to New York, staying with him. And the Winter Classic was played at Citi Field that year, Rangers versus the Islanders. And a part of it was, of course, the game on New Year's Day. But New Year's Eve, they went and bussed all of the New York Rangers families into the middle of Times Square. And we watched the ball drop. Most people have to worry about wearing a diaper or where they're going to use a bathroom. And we had porta potties and things like that. It was a really, really cool experience, and probably one that I'll never have the likes of again. I still see Meeks, once every year or so. And look, maybe there's been some drifting apart there, and I think with good reason. He has a wife and a child now, added on to what was already a busy kind of career to have. I'm now busier than ever. I'm about to get married and hopefully start a family of my own. But I still love Mika deeply. He's the closest thing I ever had to a big brother, and I never will lose the pride that I have in him to be able to see a jersey with our family name on the back of it. Hats off to him and everything that he's accomplished in his career. And, he's done a lot in the league, but, I think seeing him and his family now, that might be his greatest accomplishment of all. Mika's path was obviously very important in some ways for my own, but I don't think I ever really knew that was going to be the case until just a couple of years ago. I never really knew that sports was going to happen for me. I kind of took a lot of different paths from, let's say, the start of high school to now. When I was a freshman in high school, I probably thought I was going to be a musician. When I was a senior in high school, I probably thought I was going to be an actor. I was the potentially heaviest set Danny Zuko, John Travolta in high school productions of Grease history. Um, Freshman year in college, I was probably thought I was going to be a music teacher. And then, whether it be my sophomore or junior year, I realized that just kind of generally my future was looking really uncertain. Um, the only thing that I knew was I enjoyed being involved in improv comedy, which I know is not the coolest hobby to have. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit later. But something that always stuck with me was this one small experience I had with Owl Radio. I went to college at Kennesaw State University, and Owl Radio was the student-run radio station, and they were also broadcasting some sports. And to be able to broadcast soccer specifically was something that I thought about a lot. Actually, kind of goes back to Mika as well. We played FIFA all the time, and as we're playing FIFA, I'm kind of commentating, and he would commentate. Even when you're losing the ball, he goes, then he's going to lose the ball, then he's going to get the ball back. A lot of fun memories with that kind of stuff. And that experience with Owl Radio kind of came up out of nowhere. I was at a friend's birthday party. We were playing like pickup basketball outside of a pool. They had a net there. And, one of these people that were invited to the party was talking about working at Owl Radio. Says, the only problem is we're trying to find somebody to broadcast women's soccer at Kennesaw State right now. And like my ears kind of perked up that, I never thought that this would be an opportunity that could present itself. And so I jumped on that as quickly as I could. Ultimately, we were able to broadcast maybe 3 or 4 games, something like that. And that ended, that opportunity kind of went away, and I didn't really thought about that. It was a memory I kind of stuck back into the wardrobe of my mind for quite some time. I'm pursuing my degree in communications at Kennesaw State, and one day one of our teachers said, "Oh, just so y'all know, we've learned about this internship opportunity with Kennesaw State Athletics. If any of you guys are interested, you could go ahead and write to this email." And I started as an intern the next month, and for the first time in a long time, especially from like a professional sense, or something that you could make some sort of money in, because I was really involved with music and playing shows and having fun with that, but not really making any money from it. And then acting, and that you're almost like sinking more money into it than actually making any money out of it. And seeing like, okay, there's some sort of career here. It may not be very fruitful either, but at least it's, something in the checking account. And obviously that wasn't at the start, being an unpaid intern, but I did take to it like a duck's ass to water for really like the first time in my life that had happened to me. And I just tried to work as hard as I could. I was still a heavy set guy then. You would have to go print stats off and run them to the people who needed them, whether it was people who ran stats or people who just wanted them, broadcasters, things like that. And people might laugh, or people might giggle. They would see me sprinting across the basketball court, get stats, printed off, and run them out. But I was going to get them as quick as I could to. My boss, Nolan Alexander, who was the guy who was over me as an intern, would also then give me my first broadcast opportunity for something that wasn't just a radio. He said, "Hey, I know you're interested in doing broadcast, and we've got this soccer game coming up. I'm going to do play-by-play on it, but I don't have anyone else to do color. Would you want to do color?" And I said yes. I don't even think he was done asking the question before I had already agreed to do it. I still remember the game. It was Kennesaw State versus NJIT, and NJIT I don't even think is a D1 program anymore. This was ASUN women's soccer, and yeah, I had a little, a couple bumps in the road on the broadcast, and some of my friends still point those bumps out to me, but God, I just felt electric the whole time. There's something about getting in the booth and kind of walking that tightrope of, anything that I could say completely screw this whole show up. But there's life and there's vigor in that. It makes your blood rush quicker, and it's a beautiful feeling once you're able to thread the needle more and more as you get more experienced. Ultimately, I remember it was Kennesaw State Pro Day. If you don't know what Pro Day is, a lot of UGA, Georgia Tech fans might know. But football programs will often do like pretty much their own version of the combine for NFL scouts who come in. And, I remember actually there was another thing with that experience that is coming back to me now. For any of you who are pro wrestling fans, Braun Breaker, real name Bronson Rex Steiner. His father was Rick Steiner. His uncle was Scott Steiner. And he was one of the best, if not the best, running back in Kennesaw State Owls history. And I remember I walk in and he is in the midst of creating a new Kennesaw State record for Pro Day on the bench press. And he ends his set, I think he got like 35 plus reps on bench press at 225. And he ends his set pretty much as soon as I walk in the room. He gives a big roar. He goes, ah! And he punches the door right in front of me. And at that point, my bowels just release. Anything that was in my GI system was no longer a part of it after that. But I remember after that talking with my boss, Nolan, and Nolan being like, oh, Matina, what do you think about this coronavirus thing? Because that's what we remember. That's what we called it at the time. We didn't call it COVID-19. And I said, well, it's not looking good. I think we're probably going to have to, they're going to have to shut down school for at least a couple weeks. And boy, was I kind of off the mark on that one. Ultimately, my internship would end because there would be no more sports for the rest of the season. However, I wasn't going to give up that easy. My hair grew longer, my beard grew longer, and probably my belly grew longer as well. As, I was just a shut-in in my apartment at Kennesaw during the COVID months and years. And every week I would write an email to my old bosses at Kennesaw State saying, look, my work ethic, that I'm able to do this job. Why don't you give me a chance to come in and make some money doing it when sports come back? And ultimately, that was something that did happen. And I worked a little bit over a year as what's called an SID at Kennesaw State, Sports Information Director. An SID is pretty much the person who controls the flow of information from a sports team. For me at Kennesaw State, I was women's basketball, women's soccer, and baseball. You control the information from the team to pretty much anything external, whether it be the website, or whether it be interested publications, social media, anything of the sort. It was a lot of keeping statistics, updating record books, updating social media, updating websites. And it was something that I took to very, very quickly. And I enjoyed doing it until I realized that it was just not enough growth for me in that position. And so ultimately I looked for something else and had what was one of the best jobs I'd had in my career. I ultimately moved for a seasonal internship at Atlanta United. And what a top class organization Atlanta United is. You walk into that state-of-the-art building, practice facility to go in for work. Lunch was taken care of. It was cooked in-house. Players would eat first and then you would eat. I was eating as clean as I ever had been in my life. And this was probably one of the healthiest versions of myself. I was walking or jogging like up to 30 miles a week. And every day at lunch, they would have either like a chicken and a beef or a fish with like vegetables or salad. And I was eating clean. I was feeling good. And then I was working this job that I absolutely loved, being able to see front row what it was like to be a part of a professional sports organization. And yeah, there were tastes of that at Kennesaw State. As a matter of fact, I'll never forget our office was right, an inner portion. On the outside of it was the basketball court, the convocation center, where ultimately the basketball teams would play games and they also practiced. And whenever I heard practice going on, I would go out and sit at the scorer's table and just watch practice. And head coach Amin Abdur-Rahim of the Kennesaw State men's basketball team would interact with me. Me being there and putting myself in that position kind of pulled the curtain back, and I was able to watch what felt like, you might have seen those Amazon Prime productions of Behind the Premier League or Behind the NHL. It felt like I was having the early taste of that. And Coach Amir would interact with me from time to time again. He'd be getting into one of the guys and being like, "Man, grab that off the glass, rip that off the glass." He'd look at me, "Mateen, what's up?" And I go, "I don't know, coach," and I miss those memories, and I miss them even more now because unfortunately we lost Coach Amir some time ago, and just an absolute tragedy that really affected me for some time. I had, as minuscule of a relationship as anyone could have with him, but he struck a chord with me early on. On my very first day, he asked me, "Okay, what's your name? Well, what do you do?" He asked me my story. Someone who I wasn't going to be interacting with him much. I wasn't over men's basketball, but he put out to me that he cared that I was a part of the team and that I was contributing in some sort of way. And it wasn't him asking me what my name was the first time that stuck with me. It was him remembering it the second time. And I feel like that's, it may sound stupid, but it seems like that's a growing rarity these days. And he was such a good guy. And what a tragedy that we lost him. And I know it's been some time now, but still the condolences that I send through prayer and thought to his family have still not ended. But, I was able to see that more on the pro sports level, working at Atlanta United, going out on the porch, that balcony they have there, and watching training as I was either writing press releases or sprucing up record books. And being able to go into Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which is got to have called that home for some time, was an amazing experience and something that I wouldn't have again until some years later, which we're about to talk about. During all this time, I'm still doing broadcasts. For Kennesaw State, I was doing women's soccer, baseball, softball, women's basketball. And one day my boss kind of gave me the notion that, hey, Emory is looking for someone to call games for them, some women's soccer games. I started calling women's soccer games for the Emory Eagles. And by the time that I had left for hockey, I was calling nearly everything except men's basketball for Emory. I was doing women's hoops, baseball, softball. I was doing even some swimming and diving, volleyball. It really helped me. And, shout out to Phil Engel, who gave me the opportunity there. It really made me a more well-rounded broadcaster and gave me the bravery to be able to look a sport in the eye and be like, I'm not afraid of doing that. It may not be the sport that I know most in this world, but I'm still going to give it all I got and try to become an expert of it in 24 hours before calling the game. I would also do some stuff with Georgia High School, GHSA. I've been able to call baseball championships and soccer championships and track and field championships, volleyball championships. And I also had a great opportunity to be able to travel to call a game for the first time. My good friend, Jordan Griffith, who I've been his color and he's been my color more than any other person. He had a job working for the ASUN conference, which Kennesaw State was in at the time. They're now a part of Conference USA. And he said, hey, women's soccer tournament's coming up at Liberty University. Do you want to travel and call the games for it? And I said, yeah, absolutely, 100%. And that was a great, great experience. Lynchburg, Virginia, if you ever get a chance to go, it's a cute little town. Years later, kind of everything else in my life is blossoming as well. I meet my fiance, Paige. Well, I guess I say I meet her. That story we'll get into a little bit later because it's one of the fan questions. But I started dating Paige in July of 2023. And by May of 2024, I had been living with her. The funny thing about it, I'll get into the story of how we met years before that, but she is the most important person I've ever met in my life. And it's funny to me writing kind of the format of how this episode was going to go. I just realized like I couldn't have known how important she was going to be to me at the time. Anyway, she was extremely supportive of me and what I was trying to accomplish, this dream that I had of being a broadcaster full time. And she was always supporting me, but that support kind of grew tenfold in October of 2024. So in some research that I was doing, I found out that the city of Athens was building a multi-million-dollar arena, a state-of-the-art arena. And I was curious why that was. What were they trying to accomplish? Is this just for bigger concerts to be able to come to Athens? That was a part of it, but also they were bringing the first ever pro sports team, pro hockey team into Athens. And my ears perked up. Obviously, talking about my cousin, so much of this industry, a broadcast especially, is about who you know. And me, I've never having called a hockey game before. You're looking for ways to be able to use that connection one day, but how am I going to try and call the big guns in to try and get an opportunity when I had never called a hockey game before in my life? So I went to learn more about this hockey team that would call Aikens Ford Arena home, and it was the Athens Rock Lobsters. I went and looked at their staff directory at the time, took the email addresses of the top two guys in the organization, Anthony Schaff and Scott Hull, and emailed them and said, hey, look, this is my reel, this is my resume. I don't know if you guys already have a broadcaster. I haven't seen that anywhere, but if you guys are interested, let me know. And I would love to be able to help out in any way I can. Anthony would end up getting back to me and said, hey, we like your reel, but with that being said, like hockey is a different kind of speed, different kind of sport. Would you do like a little voiceover of a playoff game in the FPHL from the year before? It was the Carolina Thunderbirds at the time against the Columbus River Dragons in the playoffs. And as soon as I got that email, I came to this very room and cut a voiceover over it, and within 40 minutes, Anthony had an email back. Ultimately, I think that was the biggest reason why I got the job, because by the time I had gotten the job, he said, yeah, I'm still waiting on 3 or 4 other people to send me their version of it. So I wasn't going to, squander what, little crack in the door he opened for me. Ultimately, I would be calling my first hockey game for real about a week after I got hired. And that leads me to my first broadcast. We show up in Monroe, Louisiana, and I don't really know what to expect at that point. The broadcast team in Monroe is also preparing for pretty much their first ever broadcast because they were a new team at the time as well. And they're like, hey, we're not going to be able to get you a video feed. And this was like 20 minutes before the game starts. And so Taylor Costa, look into him. He's the sideline reporter for the Monroe Moccasins, also Moccasin Nation. He's the writer for them. We put my cell phone up on a tripod, and that was our game with some of the worst graphics you would have ever seen. And something amazing happened. I had this terrible call for this terrible show, and yet everyone was extremely supportive. Everyone only had positive things to say. And it was just because of the community. These people were looking for something like the Rock Lobsters, something like a reason to be able to get behind something. I don't know. I wish I could put it into words. All I know is the way that it made me feel. And I felt at home in a way that I'd never had before for a bunch of people that I never met. And ultimately, I wouldn't meet until I think it was December of that year because the rink wasn't finished until December. That's when I really first started to learn to love the community. And as I traveled around more and did this job more, I realized it's not just Athens, but it's the hockey community as a whole. And that kind of led me to start this podcast to talk about this community that has welcomed me with open arms. And I want to be able to give back to that community in any way that I can. And a lot of the episodes in the future will be dedicated to that as well, to try and continue to grow the game in the state of Georgia, which has grown immensely just over the past few years. If there's anything else you want to know about me, I'll try to cover everything else. Right now I'm getting into golf in a big way. So if you have any swing tips, let me know. I could use them. We're going to go play 18 this upcoming Sunday. I've got my fiance. I'm getting married in a month. Just a little over a month here, July 25th. Love my wife to be a whole hell of a lot. She's been, God, just the light of my life since I've met her, along with our 3 little ones, not children, but pets. My cat Jasper, my cat Abby, and my dog Milo. And yeah, I'm sure you guys are going to be able to get to know me more and more as these episodes go on. And if you guys ever want to ask a question, feel free to do so. In fact, we even have some fan questions here for episode 2, starting with a few with my fellow crustacean friend Shannon Vanskite has a few. How did I meet Paige? So I saved this story for here because I knew the question was coming up. So I told you about being involved with improv comedy when I was at Kennesaw State. I was a part of the Kennesaw State Improv Group, which was called KISS, standing for Kennesaw State Improv Society Stupid. And I remember auditioning for it, not thinking I was going to get it, ended up getting it. Was in it for about 6 months or a year, probably even less than that. And a girl with beautiful red hair, curly red hair, was started to be the assistant stage manager. And I was like, oh, this girl kind of just hates life. And ultimately, she just ended up hating improv comedy, which is funny that it is the big reason why we met. But yeah, Paige was the assistant stage manager for our improv group. And just, I don't think we really gave either uh, me to her or her to me much thought about one another until we saw each other on one of the apps years later, the 2023. And because this was probably like 5 or 6 years before that when we had first met. And I swipe right on her, she swipes right on me, and we exchange a few pleasantries. And I was like, hey, we know each other well enough. Why don't we just meet up and get drinks and talk? And then at that point, she couldn't get rid of me. Um, it's crazy to think, how quickly it all developed. And the longest step it's taken to develop now is to get married, because we've been engaged for nearly a year and a half at this point, it feels like. And now it's finally all growing to this day. So in preparing for this podcast, we've also been preparing for the next stage of my life and of my relationship. And because of that, because of y'all's reaction to this show, and also because of this next step that I'm taking with the woman that I love the most, it's just been a very exciting time in my life. Some more questions from Shannon. She said, did I play any sports growing up? I was a big baseball guy growing up. You might remember me holding that catcher's mitt in the backyard when I met Mika for the first time. Yeah, I was a huge baseball guy. That clicked in, I think it was 2005 playoffs. Braves against the Astros. Brian McCann stepped up to the plate against Roger Clemens and hit a home run, his first home run playoff home run. And Brian McCann became my favorite player. I wanted to be a catcher. Never really was one. So played a few years of Little League baseball. I did basketball as well. And good Lord, was I terrible at it. Was really, really bad at basketball. Hoops wasn't for me. I played a little bit of tennis. Besides that, that was pretty much it. I think so many people looked at me then as well when I was in high school and be like, yeah, son, you want to come play football? And no, at the time I was more, concerned with, tap dancing and learning how to sing the latest song for the musical. So it was a little bit of a dichotomy for me at that time. Do I regret it? No, ultimately not so much. I don't think my mom would have loved me playing football anyway, because she always had a big concern that if I did, I would break my neck or something like that. But yeah, football wasn't for me. Huge football fan though. Shannon also asked, if I put together a dream roster for the Lobsters, who would be on it? I think I would probably mix the players who have been the most influential to me, period, whether they be NHLers or Fed players. Let's build a starting lineup. I think a roster may take me too much time. I'm going to go with Carter McPhail in net of Athens Rock Lobsters lore. Just a great, great guy. One of the funniest individuals I've ever met, and sharing the bus with him is never a dull experience. At the blue line, I've got Carter Shinkarik and Erik Karlsson. I mean, just think about that defensive pair. I mean, it would just be all offense all the time. Two guys who are just skating, pirouetting all over the ice. Man, it would be a thing of beauty. Mika Zibanejad, obviously, at center, with Garrett Milan and Artemi Panarin on the wings. I think that as a starting five, not too bad. My go-to treat. Now, Tammy Gallant says I have to be careful. Mother of Kaysen Gallant. Look at me, all right? Obviously, I like my fair share of treats. As much as I love Tammy Gallant's cookies that I sometimes get to come home with, those aren't always readily available, as she's over in Red Deer, Alberta. And right now, I'm eating kind of healthier as I ever have. But the chokehold that True Fruit chocolate covered and peanut butter covered frozen bananas has on me right now is bad. I can't eat much of them, but I still will indulge. I'll probably have 5 or 6 of them. They're not like the full ones on a stick that you're thinking of maybe, but they're like little chunks of them. Have I ever met any celebrities? Another question from Shannon here. I've ran into a few. I mean, obviously, we talked about hockey players earlier on. I was a big pro wrestling fan growing up. And I remember me and my parents and my sister and my brother in law went to go see the Rolling Stones at Bobby Dodd Stadium, Georgia Tech, home of Georgia Tech football. And we were walking back to our car, and this guy stops me and says, "Hey, can you give me directions to this parking lot?" And I looked, and it was a guy known as DDP. Now, if you're not a wrestling fan, maybe you've heard of DDP yoga. It's a way to get fit, and it's helped a bunch of people who have mobility issues get that mobility back. That was a cool moment. When I was in Los Angeles as a small child, we were in our rental car and drove right next to Magic Johnson, who was just in an absolute beauty of a vehicle. Getting in line to meet Brian McCann when I loved baseball and when he was my hero. So yeah, that's a few of them. I'm sure there's some that I'm not thinking of though. Our next questions come from my good friend Yvette, who I've met a couple times in Winston-Salem. She asks, will you still be our beloved broadcaster for the Athens Rock Lobsters now that they've moved up, and will their games still be available on YouTube? Well, I believe I will be the broadcaster of the Athens Rock Lobsters next year. You never know. Things happen. It's minor league hockey, so, bounces happen up and down all the time. But I believe I will be the broadcaster next season. Will their games still be available on YouTube? There might be a way to have audio on YouTube or audio in another place, and that'll be something that we explore. However, the full video rights belong to Flow Sports. So to be able to watch Athens Rock Lobster games next year, you will need a Flow subscription. Yvette also says, I see PD has been given conditional admittance to the league. On the SPHL official website, I see 12 teams with Athens and Mobile being the newest. If fully allowed, that will make 13. For those with, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Yvette, so thanks for making me read it. Triskaidekaphobia, which I believe is the fear of the number 13, I think is what she's getting at. And Ice Cats fans, that could be unlucky. How does the league plan this season with a conditional team? I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's a question that I don't necessarily have the answer to. The only thing I've really noticed on that front is you're seeing more and more, and there are a couple of teams in the 12 that don't have their opening date out yet. The Rock Lobsters do. The only other team I don't think Pensacola has put their date out yet, but also PD has not put out what their first game of the season will be. Is that a worry for PD fans? It's difficult for me to say. I do think that all of the people who I know a good amount of this situation all believe that it won't be an issue, that PD will be in the SP next year. Obviously you've probably seen the news if you're following up with it on, Parker Moskal, and it sounds like he's potentially seeking a lawsuit there. I don't think it'll delay the inevitable. But again, as we said, hockey is wonky, and wonky things have happened. Daphne Harden says, please talk about the Hockey Barn and what they will offer for the hockey community in Georgia Metro Atlanta. Kind of reminiscent to what we talked about with what the Savannah Ghost Pirates are doing with the Ice Cove. I think what the people are doing over at the Hockey Barn is they're trying to ingrain the culture and they're trying to rewrite the genetics of hockey into the code of native Georgians. And I think that's great what they're doing. As I said earlier, I think so much of this show will be interview driven, and a lot of it will be about kind of what I did here, talking about why hockey is important to different people. And if we could get the Hockey Barn on the show at some point, I think that's going to be a great thing for all parties involved. Sean O'Neill, what are the odds of a third NHL expansion team in the great city of Atlanta? Well, I think it's much more of a case of when as opposed to if. Um, will it happen eventually? I think it's the 85, 90% are the odds there. Will it happen in the next 2 or 3 years? I think it's 50-50 on if they'll be the next expansion team, because right now they're jousting with Houston pretty good. I think right now, as we discussed in episode 1, obviously the ecosystem feels right to have an elite pro sports team for hockey in the state of Georgia, in the city of Atlanta. And right now you have enough interest in people who have the greenbacks to try and make this happen. 2 different ownership teams who are interested in doing it. Gary Bettman, commissioner of the NHL, used to be somewhat dismissive of it. He is not as dismissive of it anymore. So yeah, I think the odds of getting another expansion team in Atlanta is high in general. Whether they'll be the next expansion team to have that be the case, time will tell ultimately. And unfortunately, there is no more time in this episode of Peach State Puck. Again, feel free to leave any other questions wherever you follow me, whether that be Matt Teen Rad at Instagram, Peach State Puck on both Facebook and Twitter. And also, if you want to leave comments here on the YouTube side, don't forget to subscribe, like, and ring the bell to stay notified of all future videos as well. Guys, thank you so much for being a part of this ride with me, whether it be back from the Athens Rock Lobster days to the here and now with the first couple episodes of Peach State Puck. Thank you so much, and I can't wait to see you for the next episode of Peach State Puck.